Good day everyone. Let's talk about the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. Development and government are seen very differently in the Northern and Southern Hemisphere, and there are important differences between them. The North mostly include wealthy, developed nations such as the United States, Canada, most of Europe, Russia, China, Japan, and South Korea. The high per capita gross domestic product zone is where these countries are located, with low poverty levels and well-developed infrastructure. Manufacturing, technology, finance, and international trade are the primary components of their economy, and these industries are created feasible by massive expenditures in research, education, and health. In general, democratic governance system with stable governments, the rule of law, and human rights institutions are pursued by a majority of Northern Hemisphere nations. Their capitalist economies enhance public responsibility and thrive under free market ideas. These countries have a major impact over global affairs and have influenced the policy of world organizations including the World Bank, World Trade Organizations, and United Nations. However, as they often enact trade regulations and resource distribution to their fellow nations at the expense of poor Southern Hemisphere countries, their riches and power can also indirectly worsen to global inequalities. On the other hand, the Southern Hemisphere includes numerous developing nations in Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia, the region surrounding Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands. These hemispheres faces significant challenges in economic development, with numerous countries relying on agricultural, raw material exports, and industry that required low-skilled labor. Indeed, this contrasts sharply with the economies in the Northern Hemisphere, as many nations in the Southern Hemisphere depend on raw material exports, making their economies vulnerable to the impacts of global markets fluctuations. The Southern Hemisphere suffers from an exceedingly high degree of income inequality, poverty, and unemployment. They have weak infrastructure and insufficient investment in education and healthcare, along with political instability which stalls growth and development, forcing them to rely on foreign aid, creating a cycle of deep dependency. The differences of governance with this region are staggering. Some are democratic while other areas suffer under authoritarianism, corruption, and political instability. Further development has been impeded by internal conflicts, civil wars, and post-colonial struggles. In terms of socioeconomic, the Southern Hemisphere is characterized by poor healthcare, low literacy, and limited access to clean water and sanitation. But the problem is that the increase in population and urbanization is putting a lot of pressure and resources, which makes it difficult for governments to provide the minimum services that are required. All of this leads to huge income inequalities, high child mortality rated in low life expectancy compared to the majority of countries in Northern Hemisphere. Nevertheless, there is movement towards the bridging of these gaps between the two hemispheres. Northern NGOs work with intergovernmental and governmental aid to help the Southern Hemispheres in poverty alleviation, education, human health, and infrastructure. However, above that are fair trade agreements programs such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs and aid for developing countries which promote developmental economic opportunities. Globalization has been a benevolent rule in closing the gap by providing trade, investment, and technology transfer to enhance economic growth to some developing countries. Today, countries like China, India, and Brazil have emerged as economic powers that prove that with proper policies, development is achievable. In conclusion, the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere are two separate realities of economic prosperity, industrial region, and political stability.